right, welcome to Virtual Christmas Summit. Keith Wesley's presentation. He's got a number of presentations. Today, ideally, we're going to stop just for a short break in between each presentation so that we can stop the recording and continue again. Welcome back, Keith, and thanks for getting up early to do your presentation, although maybe it's not early for you. You like to be up bright and early anyway. So pass over to you, Keith. Go ahead.
Thanks, Daryl. Yeah, you're going to struggle to record this as 3 presentations. I make no guarantees that I'm going to run to a particular schedule. We'll see how it goes. The first presentation, or the first topic, which will run somewhat into the second topic, I wanted to essentially cover or recover material like I did in Sydney a few years back. Around how your data is handled, everything from when you're setting up your networks tab and your layout tab in xLights, and how that it gets represented and managed within xLights, through to how that ends up in your fseq file, what your show player does it, whether it's FPP or other, and how that gets out to your controller, what your controller does with it, and also what happens once it gets out to your pixels. So we're going to do a front to back, soup to nuts handling of all of the data. Somewhat will run into my second presentation, where we'll do a little bit of a deeper dive into the protocols, where to find specifications on those protocols and the like. And so there'll be a bit of a double handling on that material as we go through it. So hopefully that will give you a fairly significant under the covers look into how everything works in the hobby. And the reason I do that is not because it's just a whole bunch of technical stuff to geek out on, but when you get a good understanding of exactly what's happening behind the scenes, a whole bunch of stuff that you do using the sequencer and everything else suddenly starts to make sense, and you can start to better reason about how something will, or what something will do, and how something will happen. And sometimes it's a lot easier to troubleshoot things because you've got that sort of under the covers understanding of what might be happening when you do something in xLights or in your show player, etc. So hopefully that will help everyone. This is the latest in a number of presentations I've done at VCS and the like over the years, where we've done deep dives into things and got under the covers. For those that want to see my previous attempt at this, you can do so. This was the presentation. It's on my YouTube channel on xLights to pixels and how your data is handled. You can watch that. That was done in an actual classroom with a whiteboard and a computer and camera. So it's got a number of cameras and the like. So you can also go back and watch this one as well if you want to. But we're going to try and cover a lot of this in the actual presentation today. So let's start off with the networks tab, or the controllers tab, because the controllers tab really defines the channels that are available to sequence on, or at least most of the time. Behind the scenes, xLights is basically very much like a movie creator. It creates frames in a movie. Each one of those frames is either 50 milliseconds apart or 25 milliseconds apart, or other times if you want. And represents, a state of your lights for that very, very, very short time slice. In order to know the resolution of each frame, you've got to understand how to create that frame or create those channels. Now, right now, this is a brand new folder, for a brand new show folder. And so each frame is essentially 0 bytes in size. And the reason it's 0 bytes in size is because we haven't defined any controllers and we haven't created anything on our layout.
Keith,
so
Keith, are you intending to share something at this point or no?
Sorry, I am. I'm going to go and find the share button.
All right, it's coming up. We got it. We got notes or something on the left-hand side and
Yep.
xLights in the middle.
That's all right. So yeah, there's no models here and there's no controllers here. So when we go in and add something onto here, let's just add a single line of 50 pixels. There's still nothing on the controller tab, but the layout's got this single line of pixels. These pixels happen to be RGB nodes. And so essentially what this has done is it has created a buffer in which this can be rendered. Now, this is something that you need to understand because this is not always obvious. That although I've got no controllers defined, so there's no universes, there's no DDP blocks or anything else, this has still created channels behind the scenes. It's created a buffer containing 150 channels. Now, if I was to come down to here, instead of setting this to no controller, use start channel and start this on start channel 1000, the buffer has changed again. This time the buffer is 1150 channels in size because although there's nothing on those first 1000 channels, those first 1000 channels need to exist in order for this to start at 1000, right? So the buffer is the size of the largest channel that is allocated either on the models tab or on the controllers tab. If I come in here and add an Ethernet controller, change this to DDP and don't want auto size, and I set this to 50,000. Okay, let's man this out. Oh, come on. You can see that it's actually allocated 50,000 channels. So although this is only using up to channel 1150, the underlying buffer behind the scenes that xLights can render to contains 50,000 channels. It just only has one model in it that doesn't obviously use anything like 50,000 channels. So the buffer for each frame that is allocated is the maximum of what is allocated on the controllers tab and what is used on the layout tab. There it is. Yeah, and what's used on the layout tab here. So that's the first thing that you need to get your head around. So what does that look like? Well, essentially what it's doing here is, like I say, it's allocating a buffer of memory, right? Big buffer of memory. And each buffer is made up of channels. Right, each frame is made up of channels. Right, each channel is a byte, which can contain a value between 0 and 255, which of course is that channel being either fully turned off or fully turned on. Now, when I go to the controller tab here and I create a controller, let's delete this one. It's lagging really badly here. So when I add an Ethernet controller, this one, yeah. So here it's added 2 controllers with 510 channels each, and it tells me that, yeah, this is using 1 to 510, and this is using 511 to 1020. So what that means is in this buffer, the first 1 to 510 channels, right, represents the first controller. So at some point in here, we're going to reach what is channel 510. When we get to the 511th channel, that is on the second controller, and that goes all the way down. And the last channel here, of course, will be 1020. Okay. So that's how the controllers are being mapped into the buffer. Now, notice how that's got nothing to do with your models. Your models can arbitrarily then sit on exactly the same channel. So the models are mapped onto the top of this buffer. So if I was to go back into xLights here, and we've done this, right? We've set this model here to start on start channel 1000. And in fact, it runs to, we'll change this. We'll change this to start on, I don't know, channel 20. Okay. So what that's essentially done is we have our buffer, right? It's broken into two blocks, right? 1 to 510, 1 to 511 to 1020, right? And somewhere in here is channel 20 through for 150 channels. So that's going to take us up to what, 170-ish or 169-ish. Okay. And that is going to be my single line model, right? Is all going to be mapped onto these channels. So whenever I render, if I was to drop, say, in the sequencer a red color, it would set these bytes here to the various colors for a single frame. Okay, and within that, you then get further control, because you also get to do things like say that this is RGB nodes. So because this is RGB nodes, if I drop a red onto this, then this channel here, channel 20, is going to have a 255 on the red channel, right? But then it's going to have a 0 channel, and then another 255, right? Because this is pixel 1 on that string, and this is pixel 2 on that string, and so forth. Does that make sense? Now, you can, of course, change that because you have control over the pixel type here. So you can come in and say that this pixel type is very different, right? So I can come in and say that it's GRB nodes. And when I make it GRB nodes, then obviously it's not going to put 25500, right? The green is going to be 0. This is the red node, so this will be 255 and 0. So by changing the color layout on the model definition, you change the slot that xLights writes each of the values into when it renders a value onto the model. Okay, and it's doing, this is one frame, right? Behind the scenes, of course, xLights is creating multiple frames, once for each time slice. So if you're doing 20 frames a second, this is the first 50 milliseconds, this will be the second 50 milliseconds, the next one, the next one, and the next one, and so forth, right? But every frame will have this layout. Every frame is exactly the same size. The model is mapped onto the same channels in every single frame, right? But this is how it's doing it. Now, you have other controls or other things that you can define on a model, which will further impact the way in which the data is written onto the buffer. Now, it doesn't have to be 3 nodes. You can come down here and use one of these 4-channel pixel types, right? So if I make those pixels RGBW nodes, what changes now is instead of having just the 3 pixels per node, right, it adds an extra pixel in. So every pixel is now represented by 4 of these channels. And if it's RGBW, this will be R, G, B, and W. And the color handling for those RGB pixels will determine exactly how that W channel is populated when you're rendering. Okay, there are other things that you can do here which will have impacts on it. You obviously have things like, let's imagine we were doing a mega tree. You can, of course, set the number of strings to be 8, the number of pixels to be 100, and the number of strands per string to be 2. And of course, what this does is zigzags the nodes up and down the tree by strings. And if you do that, one of the things that xLights will do when it comes to mapping into this buffer clear that page, is that for the first, let's say it's in the buffer at channel 1, right? So the first pixel for the first string is going to appear here, and it's going to go 1 all the way up to 50. Of course, this is actually channel 150 because it's 50 pixels up. When it comes to the 151st pixel, right, or this slot here, because you've zigzagged it, it will reverse the channels. So will it reverse the channels in this circumstance? Well, no. It will reverse the channels in terms of the 51st pixel. It's basically putting these pixels in the order that your controller will need to have them in order to render them out. So because the controller is sending the data sequentially up, the data will get stored in that order. If you do zigzag, and we'll talk about zigzag on the controller later, the zigzag on the controller will actually shuffle the order of the data on those pixels. The other thing that you can change on your models in your model properties is you can change things like your dimming curves. So your dimming curves allow you to do things like apply gamma values or apply brightness. And I've talked in the past in a previous VCS video about what gamma is and how it impacts your pixels. But the key thing that you need to understand is that when you apply brightness or gamma using the model properties, what that's doing is changing the treatment of the value that's going to get written into one of these cells, and it's done consistently independent of any effects or anything else that you may put down. That gamma is is applied to that particular channel value before it's placed into this buffer as part of the rendering process. So there's a whole bunch of that stuff that also goes on. Now, obviously, when you set your show up, you're going to create your multiple controllers here, and you're going to define your multiple models. Of course, most of you these days don't do things manually. You set the various auto properties. So you come in and you choose your various vendors, and you leave all your auto properties on. And then you go in and visualize, and you apply your models onto the visualizer. String the tree on, etc. And all that's doing is, of course, changing the size of the channel block. So changing the buffer. So putting 510 channels here, because we're using E131. If I change the first controller here to be DDP, then it will precisely. Yeah. And obviously, because these are 4-channel pixels, it's allocated 200 channels to that first controller, and this one here, because this is E131, it's allocated a multiple of 510 channels, so it doesn't precisely size it. So one of the advantages of using protocols like DDP here is it will always allocate precisely the number of channels that are required by the props that you've put onto that controller. And that can be important, particularly in certain circumstances where you want to span a prop across multiple controllers. You want to make sure that you're ideally using something like DDP that does this automatically. Failing that, you've got to do a lot of manual handling with your E131 to make sure that it allocates precisely the right number of channels for the model, so that when the prop goes onto the next controller, it starts at the first channel on that controller. So now, obviously, it's mapped this into those channel ranges. So hopefully it's clear there how models are placed onto the buffer, how it's set out and mapped to your controller. Now, when you send the data to your controller, obviously, in this case, we've got a DDP controller and an E131 controller. So what it's doing here is in this case, we've got the 200 channels, which are DDP. Okay, now DDP will put up to 1440 channels into a single network packet. So 200 is obviously less than 1440. So all of this is going to go into a single network packet and be sent off to the controller. If it was more than 1440, let's imagine it was 2000, then the first through to the 1440th channel would go in one network packet, and then 1441 through to 2000 would go to in a second network packet to the controller, and the controller would obviously take accountability for joining that data back together. In the case of our second controller, where we've defined it using 510 channel universes, starting at universe 1, then universe 1 is that 510, 1 to 510, and then 511 up to 1020 is obviously universe 2, and these things are broken up into network packets this way, and that's what's sent over your network through to the end. And because in this case it's all been defined with every channel, every universe is 510 channels, even the last one will be 510, even if it's not full. Just the trailing channels here will just be all zeros, because xLights won't have rendered any data onto those channels. And generally speaking, frames are 0 if there's no effects that are rendered onto them, with a couple of exceptions. So hopefully it makes sense. No feedback. It's very hard to teach a class with no feedback. All right. So let's talk then about how those channels normally get filled in. And probably the easiest way to do that, and just give me 1 second. I'll bring up a PowerPoint that I normally use to cover this. Formatting this is a bit ugly, but it'll do. This is how I like to think of the rendering pipeline within xLights. It starts on the left with effects that you will drop onto a particular model. And those effects are placed onto a layer, and each layer has a buffer associated with it. And this is not incredibly obvious to people. And it's the reason why we have things like layer blending. So if I go and create an animation here, click done. Let's go and actually we'll do it on the tree. We'll insert a couple of layers. When you drop an effect onto xLights, and we're just going to drop something red onto it, it's obviously gone in, and we talked a little bit earlier about how this renders, how red gets mapped onto the buffer and writes all the red channels to those pixels or those channels in the buffer. This actually renders into its own buffer, and all the effects, if I add another effect on top of it, like let's put the circles effect on and put it on top and give colors other than red. And obviously these two effects are being blended together. What's actually happening behind the scenes in xLights is it's actually rendering each one of these effects onto the channels of the tree, but independently. So when it renders the circles, it's actually drawing the circles onto a buffer which is black, not a buffer that is red. It doesn't, paint it like it's painting a painting. It actually paints the layers independently. And then the layer blending style here controls how those layers are brought together. Okay, Now, this becomes important, and to be honest, it's true as long as you're not using canvas mode. If you're using canvas mode, then things behave quite differently. And the buffer that's presented if you set canvas mode on the circles effect, then when the circles effect starts to draw on the buffer, the redness is actually already been applied to the buffer that the circles is drawing in. But in a normal situation, it's actually drawing into a black buffer on each effect. So no matter how many effects you have here, they all render, at least at the layer level, independently. And then coming along after the fact is things like the transitions and the layer blending, etc., which all get applied when those layers are blended together. And that's represented in this here, how each effect is actually rendered onto a buffer for that model for each layer. Any transformations that you might apply, rotation of the buffer, etc., all of those sorts of things, all applied independently on each individual effect. And then the blending is applied to it, which brings all of those effects together into a single buffer, which is the data which via the understanding of where that model happens to sit in the overall frame buffer is written onto those xLights channels. Okay, now this creates some interesting utility, because one of the things that you might have used is the render cache. And when you use the render cache, what it's effectively doing is saving into a file the results of rendering an effect onto a single layer. And this is why the render cache is only used for certain effects in certain circumstances. And if you turn certain options on for effects, then the render cache will be automatically disabled, because you can't render cache effectively an effect which, for instance, has canvas mode, because it would need to know details about all the underlying layers, and it would know that it was invalid if any of the underlying layers is changed. And the render cache can't work that out. So we will not render cache any effects which happen to be using canvas mode. We also don't render cache effects which are trivial to reproduce. So in this case here, I actually very much doubt either one of these effects is being render cached, because both of these effects are really, really efficient to rerun, and probably more efficient than actually going to a file, opening the file and pulling the data out. So it's really only when you do some of the more computationally intensive or file intensive type effects that the render cache will even kick in. But when it does kick in, what it's doing is it's saving the results of rendering this layer, this particular effect, and then the blending is still then reapplied on the data that is pulled in from the render cache. So if you have 10 layers on a model with 10 different effects, which are all being render cached, you can see how that actually multiplies the amount of data that is saved and kept in those files, and then eventually loaded into memory and held into memory. So you do end up with a really large amount of memory usage when you're using something like something like the render cache, because it will hold all of those pre-rendered effects at the layer level in memory. Whereas normally when xLights is rendering on an individual frame, sure, it will have a separate buffer for each one of these effects on each one of the models. But once it reaches the end of rendering that frame and applies all the layer blending and brings it all together and puts it into a single buffer, at that point, of course, those buffers are thrown away or refreshed and reused for the next frame of rendering. So that's why render cache uses so much memory. I could really do with some feedback. Does that make sense?
Yep. So far, so good. Is there any concern? This is all real time. So is there any concern about having too many layers or too many effects? Or have we not reached that problem yet?
So you can set xLights, and I've seen xLights crash where people have gone and done something silly, like, people would used to do things like when they had a model which they didn't really want to be in their show, but they created this model and they just wanted to get it out of the way. They'd come down to the start channel here and they'd set the start channel to 1 million or something, not realizing that that meant that every frame now needs 1 million channels of zeros, based mostly zeros, because you've gone and you set that model to that crazy high start channel. It's one of the reasons why when you now come into the visualizer on this particular controller and double click and remove the model from the controller, and when you go to the layout here, you'll notice that we now move it to a channel which is outside the range of your controllers. It's not mapped onto a controller, but we move it just outside the range of your controller. And the reason we do that is because, yes, we recognize you don't want it to be on a controller, but we don't want it to be on a stupid high channel, because if we put it on a stupid high channel, that would cause every frame to be large. And xLights will allocate a buffer that is the size of each frame, in this case, 2,551, times the length of the sequence, times the frame rate. So if your sequence is 30 seconds long at 20 frames a second, that's 30 times 20, which is what, 6,000 frames or thereabouts. So there will be 6,000 frames of 2,551 bytes. And so that's how much memory xLights will allocate for the main render buffer. Okay, but while it's actually rendering, it will also allocate additional memory for each of these frame buffers for each of these effects. And then if you're using the render cache, you'll also have those buffers stored elsewhere in memory, ready to be drawn upon from the render cache. And this is why memory utilization in xLights can get really, really, really high in certain circumstances. But these days, people have got these computers with large amounts of memory, and they generally underutilize the memory, right? They run along at 20 or 30% memory utilizations. But xLights takes advantage of it. It says, well, if you're going to have the memory there, we may as well use it and deliver you the best possible rendering experience in xLights. So we're just going to suck up most of the memory that's available and use it to make this as fast as possible.
And along those lines, the length of the sequence matters, even if you don't have effects on them yet. So these people are making 30-minute sequences, probably not good to set it at 30.
When you've got a long sequence, even if you've got no effects, it still allocates that buffer. Essentially, it's the uncompressed fseq file buffer that's sitting in memory. So if you've got an hour-long sequence at 20 frames a second, right, well, that's 3,600 seconds times 20 frames a second times the frame size is the amount of memory that xLights needs to allocate to render into. Now, apart from the memory utilization, it doesn't cost any more for xLights to render into a big buffer versus a small buffer. So when you drop that one effect at the 50-minute mark and render for 30 seconds, it won't take any longer to render that 30 seconds into that big buffer than it would have to render it into a 30-second sequence. Right? Because the memory is just a big block of memory and it's directly accessed. The only time that wouldn't be true is if you ended up with a buffer that was so large that it didn't fit into memory, and now your operating system is doing things like swapping memory to and from disk, because your computer will let you allocate more memory than you physically had, and then behind the scenes it will swap that memory to and from disk, and that process is very, very, very slow compared to directly accessing the thing in memory. So generally speaking, we would not recommend that you create really long sequences, partly for the memory utilization, but partly just for the general experience of rendering and using xLights. It's not a great experience for a very long sequence.
And again, along these lines, does marking a prop as inactive or something, does that help at all? Probably not, because the channels are still there, right?
So no, so well, it depends. if you mark a controller as inactive, it has absolutely no impact at all on rendering or anything else. It will still render the data. It will still write it into the buffer. When you save the fseq file, it will still put the fseq file. All disabling a controller does is tell it to xLights and or your show player when you upload it to FPP or you play it via xschedule. It says, don't bother reading the data out of the fseq file and sending it to this controller because that controller isn't there. And that obviously means that your show player is now not trying to reach controllers that aren't there. And, you know, for a variety of network reasons, that can cause problems. And I'll cover some of those problems later when I get to xschedule.
And what about props? What about props? If you mark a prop as inactive?
So when you do a prop, so if you mark a prop as inactive, which you can obviously do in the sequence here, I can come in and say, look, this prop, disable render. So now when I drop an effect like the butterfly effect onto this prop, we've told xLights that this rendering on this prop is disabled. So there is no butterfly effect that is showing up on this single line. The data we're seeing is due to the data we're seeing is data that was there when I first dropped it down before I disabled it. Now, when I disable this, this will not render that effect at all and won't write it into the buffer. But obviously the slots will be there. It just won't render any new data into that buffer. And it's the same if you suspend render down here. You're just telling the xLights rendering engine just basically not to do any of this process here. So nothing gets written into the channels until you re-enable the render and click render all. Okay, and the reason that that can be faster is obviously it doesn't have to do all of that processing. So, you know, if you've got a big matrix that you sequence, and when you're doing something like a P10 panel or maybe even your megatree, you'll often go through and sequence all the effects on the megatree, etc. And when you're happy with them and it's looking pretty good, you often will leave that just as is, and then you'll go and sequence the rest of your house or whatever. Well, coming in and disabling the rendering on that particular element means that every time xLights need to re-render because of something else that you've done in the sequence, it will skip over that rendering. And if you happen to have already rendered it in the past and saved the data, it actually won't erase any of the data. So often the playback will still work perfectly. It's just that it's not bothering to go back and re-render everything again, which can also significantly improve your sequencing time because you're not waiting for renders to happen over and over again.
And Eric in chat was asking about performance. I think you touched on RAM as being important. What about CPU and GPU, if and when the GPU is used?
So although xLights is extremely multi-threaded, and if I render this, it's going to kick off multiple threads to render each effects. One of the things that often restricts how parallel xLights can render is the use of groups. When you place an effect, when you have multiple models which are mapped to the same channel, and of course the easiest way to do that is to come here and go create group. Right, when you go and create a group containing those two models, then the render buffer for those groups contains exactly the same channels as the tree and the single line. Okay, which means when you're in here and you're sequencing, sorry, let me grab the group and bring it in. Right, and you put an effect up on the group level here, right? Before xLights can, because now these trees and these single lines are rendering into the same channels as this group is rendering into, then xLights needs to make sure that it blends everything in the right sequence. So although this diagram that I show kind of talks about per model, etc., before it can do the final blending and bringing everything together into the channels, it needs to recognize that there's actually blending between the models, particularly where you've gone and set, and these days most people do. Sorry, wrong one, file, sequence settings. So where you have this allow blending between models, that means that in order to work out what these channel final values is, it needs to take into account the effect that is on this group, as well as all the effects that are on these models. And so before it can write that channel to the fseq file, all of these things down here have to complete in order to calculate the final value of that channel. Now, if you turn off effect rendering, blending between models, then it can now render this thing independent of this, because it's always going to overrule it. But these days, people don't generally want that. But that's the challenge with rendering on groups. Rendering on groups inherently slows your rendering down because of the dependencies. And this means that while you've got multiple threads, those threads can run on multiple processors, most of those processors end up idle most of the time. And you can see that if you've ever, when you click render, you know, just briefly down the bottom, you'll get the little status bar down here. And if you click on it, open it up, and you can see all of your models and the rendering progress. And what you'll often find is they all move in lockstep. One of the effects, one of the models will advance a frame, and then all the others will advance a frame, and then they'll all sit there and wait. And the reason is because there's dependencies in the rendering between all of those models, and it's usually because all of those models happen to sit in a group. And so it has to wait for that group to finish before it can do all of that layer blending and bring it all together. Does that make sense?
Yep, that's great.
Right. So that can significantly enhance things down, which means at the end of the day, the thing that matters most is that one CPU that is running or rendering the slowest effect, which is often on the group. So unfortunately, you don't often get as much benefit out of having these really large core counts when you're rendering out of xLights. Now, you can do it, but you've got to sequence in a very, very particular way, something that most home shows don't take advantage of, because most sequences these days are built using groups. But if you're building a big drive-through, one of the secrets to building a drive-through is to either not use groups at all, or only use groups with a specific set of elements, and not have groups that include, you know, large swathes of your show. And when you do that, the rendering tends to be quite efficient, because all those things at the model level, or just that small group, you only end up with render dependencies there. You don't end up with render dependencies across the whole show. And so now when you've got, you know, hundreds or maybe 1,000 or so props, all with effects on them, etc., they can render a lot faster because they can take advantage of all of those CPUs. Now, GPUs are a little bit different. There's a handful of effects, probably slightly more on the OS X version of xLights than on the Windows version of xLights, but there are some effects which can render using the GPU. It typically pays off. Some of the video rendering, particularly on OS X, is quite efficient. Obviously, all the shaders need to run on the GPU, but on OS X, some of the other effects, like I think Butterfly and possibly Plasma, have all been rewritten as GPU effects. So they run on the GPU, and the data is then copied back and placed into the buffer. But how that happens is, at the end of the day, not that critical.
So you have to code particularly specifically to go to a GPU. The computer just doesn't decide to use one or the other.
That's right. Code is not inherently portable. You can't, you know, the compiler or the runtime doesn't look at a piece of code and say, wow, you'd run really well on a GPU. Let me send you over there. Not only that, but how the programs are created are quite specific. There's very different video frameworks. The Windows version still uses OpenGL because it's very portable. It runs across all the operating systems. But these days, Dan has moved a lot of OS X to Metal. which is a slightly different API framework that's specific to OS X. So the work that he does on Metal doesn't really benefit on the Linux or the Windows versions of xLights. That just works for OS X. Okay. So any more questions on how the data gets handled within xLights? Is that all fairly clear? All right, so now we've got this big buffer, right? There's this big buffer in memory which contains all of these frames containing the data, and it needs to go somewhere in order to be used in your show player, and the place that it goes is the fseq file. Now, the fseq file, and if I go back to version 1 or the version 2 uncompressed, the file format really is just a smallish header that describes the nature of the fseq file, the media file that's associated with it, the number of channels, etc. And then it's literally just a dump of that memory buffer that xLights was working on, with absolutely no other handling, right? And so when you save a sequence in xLights, it writes out the xSQ file, which is obviously which effects and all the settings on the effects, but it also writes out the fseq file. And in fact, when you open a sequence in xLights, it actually loads back in that fseq file and essentially pre-populates all of that rendered data. And that's why if you save a sequence and then reload it, all of your effects play immediately. And the reason is because it's read it all back out of that fseq file. If you don't save the sequence, so if you go into xLights and you change some models around on the layout tab, etc., but you don't open the sequence, render it and save it, well, then when you next load xLights, obviously the data that's in that fseq file is the old data. And in fact, if you've changed the layout in such a way that there is a different number of channels, xLights will actually discard the fseq file when it tries to load it, because it recognizes that the fseq file is not the right size. And it doesn't know how to either shrink it down or make it larger. And so it just dumps the data and forces you to do a render all. Okay. Now, the fseq file format is a little bit more advanced than these days. There's now compression, and there's such a thing as a sparse fseq file, and I'll cover that a little bit later in the second part of my presentation here around file formats, etc. But all you really need to understand at this point is essentially the fseq file is just this dump of the large amounts of data that is in this buffer. But there's a couple other things you need to understand. And one is that the fseq file does not actually know anything about your models or anything about your controllers. So the fact that the first controller was consuming or was mapped to the first 510 channels, and the second or the rest of the channels were mapped to the second controller on our controller tab here, is not known by the fseq file. The fseq file just has, in this case, 2,551 bytes of data per frame. It knows nothing about these controllers. It knows nothing about these models. So when you generate or take an fseq file and you put it onto your controller and you start to play it, if there is an inconsistency between what was true in xLights at the time that you generated the fseq file and now, the data will still often play, but it won't look right. The data won't go to the right place. And this is why whenever you make a change in xLights, whether it's to the controller tab or the layout tab, you essentially need to go back and re-render all of your sequence, resave your fseq files and push them back up to your controllers, and obviously push the configuration to your controllers. And it's that busy work, all of that sort of coordination, which drove us to create all of the ability within xLights to push configuration out. Because at the end of the day, when you change something in xLights, your controllers have to match or it will not look right. It will not look right when xLights plays it, and it won't look right when your show player, whether it's FPP or xSchedule or whatever, plays the sequence. It won't look right if everything doesn't match up. So that's why we create everything in xLights and push it out to the controllers. Okay, so what happens then when you get to your show player? Well, on your show player just gets presented with this fseq file containing all of its frames of data, right? In this case, 2,551 channels of data, of which 1 byte is meant to go to the first controller and the 2,550 are meant to go to the second controller. Now, on your show player, you will need to tell the show player exactly how this data is going to be handled. And you do that obviously using the upload to FPP. That's what FPP Connect does. So if you've got FPP as your show player, you run FPP Connect, you upload it to FPP, and FPP knows that this first channel here is a DDP channel that's going to be sent to one particular controller, and it knows that the rest of this is 510 channels in universes. So this is universe 1 and so on. And so it knows when it reads the file that it's going to pick this data up and package it up in these network packets and send it out to the control, out to the controllers. Okay. Now, if the FPP configuration was out of date, if FPP thought that these were 512 byte universes, then it would obviously read 510 channels that were meant for universe 1 plus 2 extra channels from the next universe, and it would send that out to the controller, and confusion and bedlam would ensue, right? Because of that inconsistency between your show player and xLights. Now, in the case of xschedule, of course, xschedule, you don't push the configuration to xschedule, but you do tell xschedule what show player or what show folder that you're mapped to, right? And so xschedule does essentially the same thing, but it does it by going down to the show folder here and reading the definition directly out of the xLights files. So basically reads the networks file, which contains all of this information. And that's how xschedule knows how to read those fseq files. And so one of the things that when you run in xschedule, you can go tools and click check schedule. What it will do is it will scan through all of the fseq files that you've got defined in here, and it will do some fairly straightforward integrity checks to make sure that, for instance, that fseq file has the right number of channels according to what this show folder says that fseq file should have. Because if it's got the wrong number of channels, then obviously xschedule knows that, well, when I play that fseq file, not everything's going to match up, so it's probably not going to play okay. And so you can go in and fix it. I must admit, I don't know. FPP may have a similar ability to read through its fseq files and do some integrity checks to see whether that data appears to match the definition within FPP. If it doesn't, it could, at least to some degree. Okay, so when you click on play in your show player, I could fire up FPP, but in this case, xschedule, right, it's going to be reading from that fseq file, packaging that data up into network packets and sending it out to your controllers. But that's not all it can do. Your show players, and this is true of FPP as well, can also pre-manipulate the data before it is sent out. So one of the reasons why your show player is not as computationally intensive as xLights is that it never actually reads or generally doesn't read the entire fseq file into RAM. It actually reads each frame in one at a time. So it only needs a buffer that is the size of one frame. In this case, 2,551 bytes is the size of the frame that we've been dealing with. So it will read that data into memory, and then it can apply some overlays. Now, in the case of xschedule here, it's got a global brightness. So if you play with this global brightness, it will go through and pre-manipulate the data in the buffer that it's just read from the fseq file and apply some brightness settings. Now, both FPP and xschedule also have things like output processing. So output processing allows you to do things like pre-manipulate the data. So you can do things like remap channels. If you're running old school law controllers, one of the common physical faults that you can end up with on a law controller, if you overdrive a particular output, you can blow the triac that controls that output. And so you'll want to move that particular port from one port on your Lightorama controller to another port until you can get around to desoldering the triac and replacing it. Now, that's obviously painful to do. You can go into xLights and move the prop onto a different port, re-render all your sequences, re-upload it to your show player, and off you go, and that will work just fine. Or you can come into an output process, add a remap, and say, take the data from this channel and move it or copy it over to this other channel before you send it out to the controller. And you can do this on FPP as well. And that's a very quick way to dynamically reassign channel data in your show player before it goes out to your controllers. There's a whole bunch of other stuff you can do. You can change, you can do overlays here, etc. You can do dimming. You can do some sustain. Sustain allows you to do things like, if you've got moving heads, hold the value while, whereas in xLights it might have dropped back to 0. Sustain will say, when I'm playing this particular channel back, if it ever falls to 0, don't set it to 0, set it to the previous value and hold it on that value for a period of time, for instance. So that's output processing. The other manipulation that your show player may do is it may do some pixel overlays. You may overlay some text. You may use one of the more advanced plugins to overlay data at the time of playing onto some channels or all channels in your sequence. So there's a whole bunch of different ways that you can do that. You can also, in many cases, play multiple sequences at once and overlay data on top of each other. So if you've ever seen these people that have got shows which might have interactive elements to them. Now, some cases, those interactive elements are entirely independent, but in some shows, those interactive elements are actually normally in the show. It's just when someone happens to be interacting with that element, it overrides whatever is happening in the sequence and responds to the user's interactivity. Well, one of the ways that your show player does this is it manipulates the data that is being mapped to those particular channels and overlays it with whatever that animation or that interactivity is meant to be doing to those pixels. And so that is all applied into that frame buffer that it's read from the fseq file and manipulates it all before it packages up into those network packets and sends it out across the network to the controller. Does that make sense? So you can see why it's so important that your show player is in sync with your sequencer, but you can also see how you can do a whole bunch of overlay. Now, one of the common problems that you see is people say, oh, look, I want to do a countdown days to Christmas, right? But when I put the number of days in xLights, it always comes up as the same number of days. Whereas obviously, if you do it in your show player, it can be more real time. And the reason is it's overriding that channel data at the time that it's playing the sequence rather than baking it into the fseq file and just playing it back. And that's why you would do that sort of activity always in your show player rather than in your sequencer. All right, so now your data, it's been read out of the fseq file, all these manipulations have been applied, and now you're going to be sending the data across to your controller. What's your controller going to do with it? And this is much, much harder to show because obviously, apart from the proprietary nature of many controllers, it's also not really possible to see what's going on in a controller. But essentially, if you think about a controller in terms of what it does, where are we? At the end of the day, it's got a bunch of ports. Okay, and it needs to send that data out in the ports. And let's talk about WS2811. We can talk about other pixels later. You essentially need to send the data out as a stream of data. Now, you would send the first channel for the first pixel. The first 3 channels might go to the first pixel, and then this will be the second pixel, and so on. And you need to basically clock the data out in this serial nature out one of these ports. But you're receiving the data in these network packets. If they're DDP, they're probably really large network packets, like 1440 bytes worth of data, or it might be an E131 with a 510 or 512 bytes of data. And somehow this data has to get from here to here. And depending on the generation of the controller and the features of the controller, etc., this is going to vary significantly. But essentially, it needs to prepare the data into a data stream so it can do this sending out. And so a conceptual model might be, it might land this data in some sort of buffer and basically reassemble the buffer that is coming from the network packet. Now, it may not do this. It may not need to do this because of some rules. And so some of the lower end controllers may not have the memory necessary to reassemble all the data as it comes in. If you've got a controller that has virtual strings, then it can often do things like, randomly choose data from in the buffer and assign it to a port, and choose this data here and assign it to this. That obviously requires a lot more manipulation in the controller. And so it's only generally the higher end controllers that do things like virtual strings. But this gives you a great deal of control over the data in the controller, because not only can you do blanket things like apply brightness, but you can do gamma and color reordering and zigzagging, etc. And all of that is basically, as I pull the data out of these network packets, whether it's from a reassembled buffer or whether it's directly out of the network packets as they arrive on the controller, right? I reorder all this data and prepare it in some buffer that is ready to send it out to the pixels. Now, depending on the implementation inside the controller, each one of these may run as a separate data stream. Each one, preparing its own buffer and sending it out. In some controllers, you have to send these things out in blocks of 8 or 16. And so the buffer might need to be a lot more complex in how that data is formed. But either way, the data arrives, it gets picked apart and reassembled. Any brightness or gamma or reordering, etc., will need to get applied before the data is pushed out to your pixels. And the vast majority of pixels at this point are extremely dumb, right? They only know how to pick 3 channels worth of data off the front of the stream and then pass everything else on. They don't do any further processing. Now, that's not universally true. There are pixels out there which will do things like apply gamma at the pixel level, but the WS2811s aren't that complex. They just receive the data. Now, having received the data, what does the pixel do with the data? Well, the data value, right, if it's a 255 or it's an 80 or a 0, right, essentially the 2811 chip is storing those 3 values, and then it's generating what's known as a PWM signal. And a PWM signal, think of it as a square wave. It goes up and then it comes down, then it goes up and it goes down. And this is a consistent frequency, right? But this time here varies. So when it's 0, when the value that it's outputting is 0, this looks like that. When it's a 1, this looks like that. And obviously, any value in between, it's going to be some variation on that, right? And this affects the brightness of your pixels. So your pixels aren't actually, there's not some sort of magical analog turn the brightness up or turn the brightness down. What the pixel is actually doing is turning the LED on and off really quickly. And the brighter the pixel, the more it's on than it is off. And that's how the pixels actually generate the light or the apparent brightness of the light on the pixels. Now, this PWM signal, if this signal here is coming out at 20 frames a second, this is not turning on for a 20th of a second and off, or off for 20th of a second, or some portion of it. This is happening thousands or at least hundreds of times within this time slice, right? So this PWM signal is at a much, much higher frequency than the frame rate of the data that is arriving from the controller. Does that make sense? Time for questions, guys, if anyone would like to ask them.
Feel free to open your mics, people, if you have any questions.
Yeah, I got a question.
Yeah.
Do the players and the controllers speak to each other or only to each other? I'm trying to think if I can run two separate shows on the same network, two different FPPs, PIs, and controllers that are only associated to one of the other players and never mix.
Okay, so there's two ways that you can do that, right? So if you've got a show player here, let's say it's FPP, and you've got a set of controllers over here. These days, people don't use multicast. In the old days, people used multicast, and you had to be really careful when you did something like this. But these days, we don't do that. Everyone uses unicast. So you're telling your show player, FPP, to send it to controller 1 and controller 2. So it will send data to controller 1 and controller 2. And this is sending data to controllers 10, 11, and 12, right? And all across a common network, these things will never mix up with one another unless you've got a phenomenal number of controllers on here. The network is going to more than be able to cope with it, and everything will be fine.
Okay.
Okay. Now, you can actually have an FPP send data to show players send data to the same controller. And generally speaking, not a great idea. But it can happen, and depending on your on your controller, it can deal with it. Some of the network protocols have a technology called prioritization, right? Whoops, accidentally do that. And what prioritization allows it to do is take data from two different data sources with two different priorities, and basically, if this is the higher priority, let's say this is priority 100 and this is priority 90. When it receives a network packet from here, it will basically switch over and use the data from here. And if there's no data coming from 100, it will pull the data and use the data from here.
Okay.
Now, it is possible to do that. There are the E131 protocol, for instance, does support packet prioritization, and some controllers will implement that prioritization protocol.
But okay, but I'm just using DDP, so that doesn't matter.
No, DDP doesn't make a difference. Like I said, in general circumstance where you're not doing this, you're not sending the data to the same controller, these things will work just fine.
Okay, because I'm running inside and outside my house.
Yeah, it'll work fine.
Okay, thank you.
Keith, would that work when you're doing multi-sync?
If you're doing multi-sync, and we'll talk a little bit more about multi-sync, right? But if you're doing multi-sync, all that's happening is there's kind of on the network, there is a back channel where your master show player, right, is sending out what's known as a sync packet. And that sync packet is essentially broadcast onto the network and anything that's playing as a remote can receive that. Now, if you have multiple remotes sending multiple sync packets on a network, I think you would have problems. I'm pretty sure you'd have problems. You would need to keep the network separate. But yeah, so normally if you're using a show where you've got multiple, where you're using sync packets as a way, so rather than using a show player, you might have multiple FPPs and they're on the same network, but they're just controlling specific things. The sync packets will be sent between them, and that just tells the show player to remain in sync as to which frame it's reading at which particular second and outputting to the various controllers or outputting directly to the lights, obviously.
So the only way you could fix that would be to use the unicast option within multi-sync.
That's right. You'd have to specifically orientate it, because there's no, the sync protocol doesn't support any subnetting or whatever saying, oh, it only goes to this location. It essentially broadcasts it. It's not necessarily a broadcast. It could be a multicast, I think. but multicasts it out. And so everything in that network will see it. Any other questions?
I had a question in the chat that I put in. You mentioned that some pixels are vanilla WS2811, but others have like built-in gamma correction, for example. And yeah, what happens if you in your controller settings you already have gamma set to 2.2? Are you going to be double gamma correcting only those pixels?
So yeah, and I covered this in a presentation I did at the last VCS. I did a really deep dive into color handling and gamma and pixel brightness, did a whole bunch of testing on what happens. Essentially a gamma curve.
Yeah, I don't want my curve to be doubly steep.
Well, yeah, but this is what happens, right? So when you do brightness at the effect level, for instance, right, it will apply brightness. If you've then got brightness applied at the model level, it will get doubly applied. If you've got gamma, obviously it gets applied. At this point, it's baked into the fseq file. If on the controller, on the show player, you do another gamma, right, that gamma is being applied on top of the previously gammaed value. Right. And then if you send that out to your controller and you apply more gamma again, well, then that gamma is going to be applied on top of all of that gamma. And then if you happen to be using pixels which have gamma built in, yeah, that gamma is going to be applied on the pixel as well. Now, very few people would have these, right? These pixels are rare. I think I've only found 1 or 2 chip types which will do this, and most controllers totally ignore the functionality at any rate. So it's largely irrelevant. I think they're largely built for more advanced shows where color correction across large dense matrices or whatever really make a difference, and they want to do that gamma correction at a very detailed level. But yes, these effects are all cumulative. Your brightness is cumulative, and your gamma is cumulative. Right, and gamma, right, remember the picture that we saw where the gamma curve looks like this, right? The gamma is essentially, if the pixel's fully on, gamma does nothing. If the pixel's fully off, the gamma does nothing. It's actually the values in the middle that get adjusted down or adjusted up depending on what your gamma is.
It's just apply it at the controller and be done, and don't use gamma correcting pixels.
Well, yeah, I would generally recommend applying brightness, and well, it depends, right? If the problem with applying gamma on the controller is no matter what you play, it's always going to have the gamma applied. So if you've got a Halloween show where you want gamma, because lots of people like what gamma does to your oranges and your purples, so they want the gamma applied in their Halloween show, but they don't want it applied in their Christmas show because the colors don't really need it. Right, then you're better off doing it on your Halloween props and applying your gamma there. The problem with that is if you then want to change the gamma, you've got to go back and re-render all your sequences and re-upload them to your show player in order to play them. Whereas if you apply the gamma correction or the brightness connection either on your show player or on your controller, then you don't have to go back and re-render and re-upload whenever you want to change anything. You just apply it in one place and it just happens.
Okay, that was my question.
And this was the video I did last year, the other year on VCS, which talked about gamma and pixels and everything. And it got very technical.
Yeah, my problem came about at Halloween. It was the oranges look like whites.
Yeah, and to be honest, you don't need to use gamma to correct your oranges and your purples for Halloween. You just need to understand how did that gamma curve affect the value and change the value of your oranges and your purple to be the gamma corrected orange and purple. And then at that point, you don't need to apply any gamma at all. Right? It only then becomes relevant if you blended colors. It works, that would work fine for your absolute colors. It just wouldn't work well for your blended colors and the like. Anyway. Last call for questions. I'm going to move on to my next topic.
Probably a good time. I'm going to stop recording.